In September 1297, on the banks of the River Forth, a ragged Scottish army of commoners, farmers, and a handful of knights prepared to face the might of England. Arrayed against them was one of the most powerful armies in Europe, led by the Earl of Surrey under the banner of King Edward I. Yet what followed was no simple clash of steel, but a masterstroke of strategy. William Wallace and Andrew Moray turned a narrow wooden bridge into a death trap, annihilating an enemy many times their size. The Battle of Stirling Bridge became not just a military victory, but a defining moment in Scotland's long fight for freedom. The year was 1296, and the proud Kingdom of Scotland lay broken beneath the iron fist of England's King Edward I. A man history remembers as the Hammer of the Scots. Scotland, once an independent realm with its own crown, its own nobles, and its own stubborn sense of freedom, had been shattered in a single year of conquest. The great Scottish defeat at Dunbar that spring had left the nobility crushed, castles surrendered, and towns occupied. Edward I moved swiftly to impose his will. He seized the Stone of Destiny from Scone, the sacred coronation stone of Scottish kings, and transported it to Westminster as a trophy, a symbol that Scotland's independence was gone. He forced nearly every Scottish noble, knight, and landholder of note to swear allegiance to him through the infamous ragman roll. With the ruling elite bound to him by oath, whether through fear, pragmatism, or ambition, Edward believed Scotland was pacified. But conquest on parchment and conquest in the hearts of a people are not the same thing. The English crown imposed harsh taxation on Scotland, overseen by Edward's officials, who drained the land of wealth to finance the king's endless wars in France and Wales. Soldiers garrisoned towns and strongholds, often treating the Scottish population with disdain. Most notorious of all was Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland. Cressingham became a hated figure, remembered for his cruelty and greed. Stories spread of him bleeding Scotland white, enriching himself at the expense of starving peasants. Everyday life for common Scots grew harsher. Farmers saw their grain and livestock requisitioned to feed English armies. Merchants were forced to pay heavy tolls. Priests were watched with suspicion, and whispers of rebellion brought swift punishment. Scotland, in short, was occupied, but never tamed. Though many of the great lords had bent the knee, resistance began to flicker among the lesser nobility, and more dangerously for Edward, among the common folk. Rebellion was not yet coordinated, but erupted in scattered acts of defiance. English tax collectors were ambushed on lonely roads. Garrisons were harassed at night by small bands of armed men. Castles under English control found themselves besieged by local insurgents. Two figures emerged as the living symbols of this growing unrest. In the north, Andrew Moray of Bothwell, a young nobleman who had escaped English captivity after Dunbar, raised the banner of revolt in the Highlands. With cunning and persistence, he rallied clans and freeholders, laying siege to English-held castles in the north of Scotland. In the south, a figure of humbler origin but fiery spirit rose to prominence: William Wallace. His name first entered English records in May 1297, when he killed the English sheriff of Lanark in an open act of defiance. Soon, Wallace and his band of rebels were striking at English patrols, raiding supply trains, and vanishing into the forests. To the English, he was a criminal. To the Scots, a hero in the making. By the summer of 1297, Scotland was aflame with revolt. Wallace and Moray had not yet joined forces, but both were gathering strength. The people, embittered by English oppression, flocked to their banners. Farmers abandoned their ploughs, craftsmen laid aside their tools, and young men eager for vengeance took up spear and sword. Edward I, however, was absent from Scotland. His ambitions turned toward France. Control of the country fell instead to his lieutenants: John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, a seasoned but aging commander, and the despised Hugh de Cressingham. Surrey prepared to march north with a great English host, determined to stamp out rebellion once and for all. What awaited him, however, was no ragtag mob. By September 1297, William Wallace and Andrew Moray had united their forces near Stirling, and together they were about to unleash one of the most brilliant ambushes in medieval history. The chronicles describe William Wallace in fragments, and legend has filled in what history leaves blank. What we know for certain is that he was not a great noble. Born into a minor landowning family in Elderslie near Paisley, Wallace had little to lose and everything to gain when the English tightened their grip on Scotland. By 1297, Wallace's name was already whispered with awe and fear. English records brand him a murderer, a brigand, and an outlaw. Scottish memory remembers him differently, as the man who dared strike back when others bowed their heads. His rebellion truly ignited in May 1297, when Wallace led a daring attack on the Sheriff of Lanark, William Heselrigg. The English official was slain, his men scattered. This act, whether sparked by personal vengeance, English cruelty, or both, set Wallace on a path of open war. The slaying of Heselrigg was a thunderclap across Scotland. To the English, Wallace was a dangerous criminal. To the Scots, he became the embodiment of defiance. Wallace's band was small, but deadly effective. He recruited from among peasants, outlaws, and disinherited men, anyone with reason to hate the English. They knew the forests and hills, and they struck where the enemy was weakest. English patrols ambushed in narrow glens. Supply trains burned before reaching garrisons. Garrisons attacked at night with fire and surprise. Wallace understood something crucial. He could not fight the English on open ground. Instead, he fought a war of shadows, a war of attrition. Each victory, however small, spread his fame and drew more men to his banner. While Wallace fought in the south, Andrew Moray, heir of the Morays of Bothwell, had kindled revolt in the north. Having escaped captivity after the disaster at Dunbar, he returned to his homeland and raised the standard of rebellion at Avoch in Moray. Moray's campaign was bold. He gathered support from Highland clans and freeholders, besieging English-held castles and cutting off communications between garrisons. His victories were quieter than Wallace's, but no less significant. Moray showed remarkable skill in organizing and sustaining resistance across a broad region, proof that Scotland's rebellion was no longer the work of outlaws alone, but of a rising national movement. Through the summer of 1297, rebellion spread like wildfire. In the north, Moray pressed the attack on English strongholds. In the south and central lowlands, Wallace's raids terrified English authorities. By late summer, both men were recognized as leaders of Scotland's resistance. The church, too, began to shift. While some bishops remained cautious, fearing Edward's wrath, others quietly blessed the rebellion. Priests offered sanctuary to rebels or gave coin from parish tithes to help arm them. The cause of freedom was gaining legitimacy. At some point in August or early September 1297, the paths of Wallace and Moray converged. Their forces, though raised in different regions, shared a common purpose. Together, they commanded perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 men, not a professional army, but a determined one. It was at Stirling, near the narrow wooden bridge across the River Forth, that they chose to make their stand. Their plan was audacious, to lure the vastly larger English army into a trap. Meanwhile, Edward I's lieutenants gathered a mighty host. John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, marched north with thousands of infantry and cavalry. His treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham, urged a swift and crushing blow to extinguish rebellion before it could spread further. By September, the English army, numbering between 8,000 and 12,000 men, had reached Stirling. They expected the Scots to melt away before them. Instead, they found Wallace and Moray waiting, their troops hidden on the slopes above the narrow wooden bridge. The stage was set for one of the most brilliant and unlikely victories in medieval history. The town of Stirling, perched on a rocky crag crowned by its castle, had long been known as the key to Scotland. Whoever controlled Stirling controlled the crossing of the River Forth, the natural boundary between the lowlands and the highlands. To the south lay the fertile farmlands and roads to England. To the north stretched the rugged lands where rebellion was gathering strength. The River Forth itself was wide and marshy at this point, with a single narrow wooden bridge connecting the banks. This bridge would prove the fulcrum on which the fate of nations balanced. To the English, it seemed no more than an obstacle to be crossed. To Wallace and Moray, it was the trap they had been waiting for. The English army, commanded by John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, marched north in September 1297. Estimates vary, but most chronicles place its strength between 8,000 and 12,000 men, including heavy cavalry, the pride of English armies, hundreds of mounted knights in gleaming plate and mail, supported by squires and mounted men-at-arms, infantry levies, thousands of foot soldiers drawn from England's shires, armed with spears, axes and bows, Welsh archers, skilled longbowmen, deadly in open battle, but less effective in the marshy ground near Stirling. Surrey himself was aging and in poor health. His subordinate, Hugh de Cressingham, pushed aggressively for action. Arrogant and despised by the Scots, Cressingham saw the rebellion as a nuisance to be swatted down quickly. The English commanders believed they faced no more than a rabble, easily dispersed by the might of England's cavalry. On the north bank of the Forth, hidden among the rising ground near Abbey Craig, Wallace and Moray waited. Their force numbered perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 men, a patchwork army of spearmen, swordsmen, and a scattering of archers. Few wore heavy armor. Most fought in simple leather jerkins or padded gambesons, carrying spears as their primary weapon. What the Scots lacked in equipment, they made up in determination and tactical cunning. Wallace and Moray organized their men into tight formations of schiltrons, circles or rectangles bristling with long spears, designed to repel cavalry. On open ground, these formations might falter under repeated charges, but on the marshy banks of the Forth, hemmed in by the narrow bridge, they could prove devastating. The mood of the two armies could not have been more different. In the English camp, confidence reigned. Knights polished their armor, boasting of the easy victory to come. Many looked forward not just to battle but to plunder, imagining Scotland as a land ripe for spoils. Some even scoffed at the thought of Wallace and Moray daring to face them in open confrontation. Among the Scots, the mood was grim but resolute. These men fought not for glory or plunder, but for survival. Many had seen their homes taxed and burned, their families abused under English occupation. They knew they were outnumbered and outmatched in equipment, but they also knew the land, the river, and the value of the bridge. Victory here would not just be a battle won, it would be a symbol that Scotland's freedom could still be defended. As dawn broke on September 11, 1297, the two armies faced each other across the Forth. The English plan seemed obvious: march their army across the bridge and crush the Scots in overwhelming force. Wallace and Moray, however, had no intention of meeting them on equal terms. Instead, they waited patiently for their moment, allowing only a portion of the English army to cross before springing their trap. It was a plan that required nerves of steel. One false move, one premature charge, and the Scots could be annihilated. But Wallace and Moray trusted their men and trusted the bridge to do what swords could not. The morning of September 11, 1297, dawned cool and misty. The River Forth lay shrouded in fog, its waters sluggish beneath the narrow wooden bridge. From the south bank, the English army stirred to life, banners unfurling in the dim light, armor clanking as knights mounted their steeds. On the north bank, Wallace and Moray kept their men hidden behind the rising ground of Abbey Craig. The Scots waited in silence, spears planted firmly in the earth, the dew glistening on their makeshift armor. They could hear the neigh of English horses and the roll of drums across the water. But they did not move. Their commanders had given one clear order: wait until the trap is set. In the English camp, disagreement flared. Some of Surrey's advisors urged caution, suggesting the army find another crossing point. There was a ford a few miles upriver, though it would require a longer march. The Earl himself, weary and ill, seemed inclined toward patience. But Hugh de Cressingham would have none of it. Impatient and eager to crush the rebellion quickly, he argued that delay was cowardice. He insisted the Scots were nothing more than a rabble, unworthy of serious concern. Why waste time marching upriver when the bridge lay before them? To Cressingham, victory was already assured. His words prevailed. The English would cross at Stirling Bridge. As the sun lifted higher, the English vanguard began to cross. The bridge was narrow, so narrow that only two mounted men-at-arms could ride abreast. What should have been the thunder of a charging host was instead a slow, halting procession. One by one, knights, infantry, and archers filed across, their banners fluttering above the mist. On the far bank, The land narrowed between the river and the marshes, hemmed in on both sides. It was here that Wallace and Moray waited, hidden from view, their men poised like a coiled spring. For hours, the Scots remained silent as the English poured across. The temptation to strike early must have been immense. Each knight that crossed added to the enemy's strength on the north bank. But if the Scots attacked too soon, they risked being overwhelmed before the trap could close. Wallace, grim and unflinching, watched as the bridge groaned beneath the weight of horses and men. Moray, ever the careful strategist, reminded his men to wait until enough of the enemy had crossed. But not too many. Timing was everything. Finally, when perhaps 2,000 English troops, including heavy cavalry and infantry, had crossed, the signal was given. With a roar, the Scots surged from their hiding places, the air filled with the sound of war horns, the clash of weapons, and the defiant cries of men fighting for their homeland. Spears bristled like a living wall as Wallace and Moray led their schiltrons downhill toward the trapped English. The English knights, hemmed in by marshland to their flanks and the narrow bridge to their rear, suddenly found themselves crushed into a bottleneck. There was no room to maneuver, no space to unleash the devastating cavalry charge that had won them so many battles. Instead, they were forced to fight in confusion, pressed against each other as the Scots closed in. On the bridge itself, panic erupted. Men still crossing saw the disaster unfolding on the far bank and tried to turn back. Horses reared, men fell into the water, and the wooden planks grew slick with blood and mud. Those trapped on the north side could see no escape. Their comrades were blocking the only way back. The Scots pressed their advantage mercilessly. Spears drove into the chests of armored knights, horses toppled screaming into the river, and infantry were cut down where they stood. The English had marched confidently into a slaughterhouse of their own making. Among the dead was none other than Hugh de Cressingham himself. The hated treasurer, who had mocked the Scots and urged reckless haste, was cut down in the fighting. By midday, the English vanguard on the north bank was annihilated. Hundreds lay dead in the mud, their armor glinting in the sun, their bodies piled among broken lances and shattered shields. The survivors who tried to flee across the bridge found it jammed with retreating men. Many leapt into the river, only to drown beneath the weight of their armor. The proud knights of England had been brought low by common spearmen, by cunning and by the trap of the bridge. While Wallace and Moray's schiltrons crushed the English vanguard north of the river, chaos spread across the south bank. From there, thousands of English soldiers watched in horror as their comrades were slaughtered before their eyes. At first, some believed it was a momentary setback. Surely, they thought, the knights would rally, form up, and carve their way through the rabble of Scots. But as the minutes dragged on, it became clear that no rally was coming. The bridge, clogged with men retreating or fleeing, offered no relief. Instead, it became a death trap, buckling under the crush of bodies. The Earl of Surrey, John de Warenne, was a veteran commander, but age and illness had dulled his decisiveness. Reports flooded into his camp. The vanguard was collapsing, men were drowning in the Forth, knights were being dragged from their saddles by spear-wielding peasants. Some of Surrey's captains urged him to commit the rest of the army, to storm the bridge and overwhelm the Scots with sheer numbers. Others warned that the bridge itself was too narrow and unstable, and that sending more men across would only add to the slaughter. Surrey wavered. His indecision proved fatal. On the north bank, Wallace and Moray urged their men to press harder. The schiltrons advanced with relentless force, tightening the noose on the trapped English knights. Horses screamed as they toppled into the mud. Armored men flailed helplessly as spears pierced their mail. The Forth itself ran red as drowning men thrashed beneath the weight of steel. Wallace, towering in the chaos, shouted for no quarter. This was more than a battle. It was vengeance for the humiliation of Dunbar, for the burning of villages, for the years of English rule. The Scots fought not just with weapons, but with fury. The wooden bridge, groaning under the weight of men and horses trying to flee, finally began to collapse. Planks snapped, timbers cracked, and entire sections gave way. Dozens of men plunged into the river, their screams swallowed by the rushing water. Some tried to swim, but their heavy armor dragged them under. The bridge had become both battlefield and graveyard. With their vanguard destroyed and the bridge in ruins, the remaining English army dissolved into panic. Surrey, unwilling to risk his entire force, gave the order to retreat. Knights and foot soldiers alike abandoned the field, throwing aside weapons and banners in their desperation to escape. Some fled south toward Berwick, others scattered into the countryside, only to be hunted down by Scottish bands in the days that followed. The great English host, which had marched north with such arrogance and confidence, was now a shattered remnant. When the dust settled, the battlefield was a charnel house. Thousands of English soldiers lay dead on the north bank of the Forth, their bodies stripped of arms and armour by jubilant Scots. Wallace and Moray, their men bloodied but victorious, stood as heroes. Against overwhelming odds, with little more than courage, cunning, and the land itself as their ally, they had destroyed one of the finest armies England could muster. Yet the Scots, though victorious, had also lost many brave souls. Among the most grievous wounds was the fate of Andrew Moray. Struck in battle, he would not live long to see the fruits of their victory. His leadership, paired with Wallace's fiery will, had been essential to Stirling, and Scotland would soon mourn his absence. The victory at Stirling Bridge sent shockwaves through Britain. For the first time, it was clear that the English were not invincible. A force of common men, led by two determined commanders, had brought down the might of Edward I's army. Across Scotland, church bells rang and fires were lit on the hills. Men flocked to Wallace's banner. Nobles who had wavered now saw that resistance was not only possible, but victorious. Stirling Bridge had transformed rebellion into revolution. In England, the defeat was a humiliation. Surrey barely escaped with his life, his reputation tarnished. Edward I, campaigning in France, would soon hear the shocking news that his conquest of Scotland was unraveling. Before Stirling Bridge, William Wallace had been a name known mostly in whispers. An outlaw, a rebel, a dangerous thorn in England's side. After Stirling, his name thundered across Scotland and beyond. In the span of a single morning, Wallace had transformed from a guerrilla leader into a national hero, the very embodiment of Scotland's fight for freedom. The victory shattered the myth of English invincibility. No longer could Edward I claim that Scotland was subdued. No longer could the English crown present its conquest as complete. A people once bowed beneath occupation now had proof that resistance could succeed. Wallace was thrust, almost overnight, into the role of guardian of Scotland. With Andrew Moray gravely wounded at Stirling, he would die of his injuries within weeks, leadership of the rebellion fell squarely on Wallace's shoulders. The destiny of a nation now rested with the outlaw who had dared to fight back. In the months that followed Stirling, Wallace moved swiftly to consolidate Scottish power. English garrisons, unnerved by the disaster, abandoned many castles and strongholds. Wallace's forces swept through the countryside, reclaiming towns and fortresses that had fallen under English control. The Scottish nobility, many of whom had bent the knee to Edward after Dunbar, now saw which way the wind was blowing. Some openly joined Wallace, while others offered cautious support. Though not of noble birth himself, Wallace carried the authority of victory, and the people rallied to him with unmatched loyalty. Chroniclers note that Wallace's charisma was as powerful as his sword. He inspired men not just by command but by example. He was known to eat the same food as his soldiers, to march alongside them, to endure their hardships. To the common folk, Wallace was not a distant lord, but one of their own. A man who had risen from the same soil and fought for the same freedom. His presence became symbolic. When Wallace entered a town, banners unfurled and the bells of churches rang. Mothers told their children of his deeds. Priests wove his name into sermons. The rebellion was no longer faceless, it had a champion. Yet victory came with sorrow. Andrew Moray, Wallace's co-commander at Stirling, succumbed to his wounds not long after the battle. Moray had been a brilliant strategist, a nobleman whose name carried weight among Scotland's elite. His death was a severe loss, not only to Wallace personally, but to the entire movement. Wallace now stood alone at the head of the rebellion. For a man without noble lineage, this was a precarious position, but Wallace's legitimacy was built not on birth, but on triumph. He had shown that Scotland could be defended. for now that was enough. Flush with victory, Wallace did not simply defend Scotland. He went on the offensive. In the autumn of 1297, he led raids deep into northern England, striking fear into Northumberland and Cumberland. These raids served multiple purposes. They weakened English morale and demonstrated Scottish strength. They provided supplies and plunder to sustain the Scottish army. They sent a clear message to Edward I. Scotland would not merely resist but retaliate. English chroniclers, horrified by the devastation, described burning villages, shattered garrisons, and terrified peasants fleeing before the Scots. Wallace's raids turned the war into a two-sided conflict, proving that the Scots could bring the fight into England's own lands. By the end of 1297, Wallace had been formally declared Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the absent King John Balliol, then in captivity in France. It was an extraordinary ascent for a man of his background. From outlaw to guardian in less than a year, Wallace now stood as the political and military leader of Scotland. His seal, preserved in history, bore the words, "William, by the grace of God, Guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland and leader of its armies." The Battle of Stirling Bridge may have ended in 1297, but the war for freedom continued through Wallace's legend. His fight became Scotland's fight, and his name became Scotland's eternal cry. Freedom.